and we will record the session. If you want to rename yourself, you should be able to do that so that you know how this works in FI Connects. We often talk and share with each other, and so being able to see your name is great. And we might even ask you to jump off and unmute yourself and jump on to share a little bit later on. I think you all know the format of these sessions, but we will have some information we'll share with you. We want it to be discussion and for you to share your ideas. So hopefully we can continue to grow in our knowledge as we think today about starting back to school next year, which is hard to believe that we're already there, but we are. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Teresa.
Sure, and we are going to start just thinking about ourselves and starting with some self-awareness. And so we're asking on a continuum this week if you would drop into the chat kind of where you're at with all of the uncertainty around how we're going to reopen for 2021. So you might be just like, it's all going to work out, it's not stressing me out, or you might be more like me. I'm a planner and I like to have my plans started. So I'm closer to a 1 on this scale. Or you might just be in the middle, like I'm okay, not stressed out yet, feeling good. I love that. Somebody's a 1 with me. That's wonderful. Yeah, between 1 and 5. 7, good. Yes.
Curtis, I want to be with you in that Zen place.
In Zen, feeling the jealousy. I know I might need you to talk me off the ledge a couple of times because I am definitely, I love to have my plans. I can flex, but I like to have my plans in place early and then change them as I need to. But I love that Joel says excited. That's great. Good for you getting to that point of excitement already for next year and kind of thinking about what we can do. I want plan A, B, C, D, and D. Me too. In fact, I've got them kind of in my head already because, you know, in the absence of information, I start to fill in the gaps. But yeah, thinking about as we go into this, there's definitely a lot of uncertainty still, and how can we think about this as leaders? And so this session is based on feedback from prior sessions about kind of what the need was going to be when we got to this point in May. And so Nancy, if you just want to click forward for me, we can talk about what we've decided together to call this session is planning in pencil. And that is a favorite phrase of ours anyway, because we always, as leaders, need to create our plans in pencil, just because we know that we are going to be hearing information throughout the summer that might shift even our best laid plans. And so going into this eyes wide open, we're going to talk about kind of our roles as leaders and then the things that we think are sort of essentials and must-haves going into next year and the things we're hearing about. And of course, as always, we want to hear your must-haves, your essentials, things you know are going to stay rooted no matter what changes this summer. So we will stop along the way, and we do ask you to jump right in. And we love to ground our thinking. This is Nancy and my kind of favorite, easily accessible change management framework. As leaders, we're always responsible for managing complex change, but we are going to be going into next year probably experiencing a lot of accelerated complex change. And so keeping in mind as we go through today's session that regardless of how much flexibility there will be, we will still need to be setting a vision and communicating our vision along the way, and then providing, even if it's week by week, the supports for skills, the incentives, the resources, and always iterating that action plan as we go through this process so that people don't have the fear, anxiety, confusion as much as if we didn't have these pieces in place to support their success and our success as school leaders. So we are going to dive right into our metaphor, and the way we're thinking about this planning in pencil process is that what we're really looking for is something very much like a tree. What we want to build and grow over the summer are plans that are both strong with that trunk and the roots and keeping us grounded, but that have a lot of flexibility for when those winds come in and start blowing and the storm is hitting. So as things change, what are we going to have to be flexible about? And we're thinking there's a lot of things that we know might flex. So coming into the idea of flexibility, a lot of things could change. Timing is one that we know for sure. Like we have an August 17th date. I know some of you might be year round and you're looking at July. But thinking about timing, not even just timing, but like scheduling and how will the kids be grouped? And are we going to have to do smaller groups? And how is that going to work? And where's it going to happen? Will there be some things happening remotely, some things happening on site? And how can we plan for maybe some people going into a 14-day quarantine, whether that be staff or students, and thinking about all of these things that we typically going into summer know a decent amount about are suddenly in this flexible category. So these are the things we're going to have to really let leeway into our planning around. But then there are definitely some strong roots that we know we are going to have in place to be successful at kickoff next year. And so these are more of our like non-negotiable pieces. And going in the planners, those of you who are down at 1 with me, or even those who are up at 10, thinking about like, yeah, maybe it is all going to work out because we're going to have to build in structures that help support whatever the flexibility that's happening on top of our tree needs. And so thinking about structures that blend, and not just the typical way we use blended learning, but blend between the face-to-face setting and the remote setting. And we know that a lot of these things look very different in those settings, but how can we set up structures that are going to help us be successful in both of these areas next year? Because we are going to have to rely on a little bit of both and some sudden changes. And then how can we capitalize on the community and empathy to kind of start fostering that effective instruction that we know we need to create for our students so they have this best possible experience, and so that our teachers have the best possible experience that we can plan for with some strong roots. And so that's the framing that we're thinking of going into some of these things. A lot of the things we're going to talk about are these strong root structures that we know are going to have to be in place, and leaving the flexibility in that open area where we know we're going to have to plug those plans in along the way. And Nancy's going to kick us off now thinking about all of our staff. Like what kind of roots are they going to need to be successful next year?
Yeah, so let's talk about staff with those strong roots. And, you know, we know that setting up our classrooms and building structures that blend will help us be more successful. You know, we were all thrown into this remote learning environment very quickly. And with maybe you had a day or two to prepare. Many of us did not. We left on Friday and we didn't ever return, or you know, right away we were thrown into this. And so with, you know, we don't know what's going to happen in the fall. We don't know what the governor's task force and they're going to tell us about schools. But we do know that we need to set our classrooms up for success. And there are things that we can do, like Teresa said, some non-negotiables. So making sure that classrooms have an instructional hub is going to be key to success. This can be a website. It can be an LMS. But if you are using an LMS, be thinking about how will families stay connected and informed. I know this is particularly important as we think not just about elementary school students, but really all of our students. Sometimes we think, oh, middle school, high school students are old enough, they should be able to do their work on their own. But sometimes parents want to make sure that they're in the loop too. So, you know, if you're using an LMS, how will parents be able to help and support in that? Also, what two-way communication tools will teachers be using? Again, we know that many of our teachers have kind of cobbled this together. You all have supported them in putting all this together this year, but now we want to think about going into next year. How can we really make sure that we have a strong foundation in these things? So to do that and have success in setting up our classrooms, both as an instructional hub as well as those communication tools, we might be thinking, what professional development do my teachers need? You might already know it. And I'm sure that you've had a lot of just-in-time professional development this year, or or the past 2 months. Your teachers, I had one leader say to me, you know, now more than ever, it's very evident of which teachers were on board with using technology and which teachers had kind of been saying, yeah, I'm not going to do that. Like, you've been doing a lot of professional development. And they were like, yeah, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to close my door and do what I want. But all of a sudden, this light has been shown or shine down upon. And we really see who needs professional development and what individual supports do teachers need. So in thinking about that, as you're building those structures, last week we talked about surveying staff, but we might need a survey specific to technology. If our expectation is that every teacher has a classroom website or a hub, maybe we need to know, do they feel comfortable or do they have the skill set? And so here are some questions that you might want to think about if you survey the staff specific to technology, especially thinking about what tools are they using and what tools do they need some more support on. Another important piece of building a structure that is blended is what Teresa and I are going to call seamless learning. We know that the school year 2020-21 will probably require that we are able to have seamless learning between face-to-face and remote. As much as we all want to believe that we're going to be able to go back and everything's going to be face-to-face all year, I think we all really know that there might be parts of the year that won't be able to be face-to-face. And so how can we set up this seamless learning environment so that it's not such a huge shift if we have to go into periods of remote learning? So a couple of key things here is teachers, as they're planning, maybe thinking about chunking material into smaller portions, because we know when we go into remote learning, students, we can't spend as much time or large chunks. And so how can they go ahead and begin to plan and chunk material into smaller portions? How can they differentiate? We already know differentiation is kind of a word of the past in some ways, or it's not very sexy, right? Differentiation, but differentiation is now more important than ever, especially in remote learning, right? And so how are we making sure that teachers not only understand what differentiation is, but that they're actually implementing it or using it? And then, of course, the technology tools, how are we using those as soon as we go back so that students know and feel comfortable with them? Developing learner agency and prioritizing social emotional learning, I think, are going to be important things, and Teresa will talk more about them. But we feel like these are really key things in order to have that seamless learning, being able for us to transition between that face-to-face and remote. And I loved Curtis earlier said something about he had teachers who would quarantine themselves every Friday or Monday anyways, with a little bit of sarcasm, I'm sure, and a smile there when Curtis said that. But, I think that it really is important to think about, it's almost like we need to have sub plans on hand all the time for our teachers. And we say that the word sub plans, not literally that someone else is going to come in and teach, but that we need to be prepared that we might have to go to remote learning at any time. And so that kind of backup plan for remote learning at all times. And I think that might be, a kind of a mindset shift that we have to help teachers with, especially if we're able to go back, fingers crossed, face to face. It might be easy to fall into that lull. Another thing that is going to be really important to get those strong roots is using data to inform instruction. Again, kind of like differentiation, something that we always have known, but now how are we making sure that we have data? And we talked about data, using data and collecting data for the end of the school year, but how are we now going to make sure that we use this to help make sure that students are making the progress that we need? And again, differentiation, more important than ever. So data really helps to inform differentiation, but we also have to set up those structures that encourage sharing. And I know you've heard Teresa and I talk about this before, but vertical PLC meetings at the beginning of the year, going into that, as well as maybe data walls or documents that are tracking our student progress and mastery of specific content standards are going to be really key and important for that strong foundation for next year. Another key important thing is creating a reentry team. And you might have already done this. You might be thinking, okay, might be a little late for this, but Teresa and I have two documents here, one that we created and then one that our colleague and friend Dean Phillips created. Teresa, are you able to drop those links in the chat? The first one is a rubric to support your team. And this rubric is a single point rubric and maybe helps you to kind of begin to think about where are your teachers in some of these. It will force you to make a copy, but that's great. Make that copy and then this is yours. You can mark it up. You can change it however you would like to. The second one, the questions for consideration before reopening, is a document that has a lot of questions that you might be thinking about. Maybe some of these questions are beyond your control as a school leader, but hopefully they'll give you a couple of maybe thoughts and maybe things that you haven't already been thinking about. So we're going to give you just a couple of minutes to kind of take a quick look at these. And then we want to have a discussion and kind of see where you are and what you're thinking about as related to your staff and how to support them in the reentry process. So I'm going to give you about three or 4 minutes. If you need help opening those, let us know. All right, so hopefully you've had an opportunity to open up the document or both documents there. Any thoughts or ahas as you look at these two documents, whether it's the rubric or the question to consider? Sorry, I'm looking, went to scroll in the chat and it's moving the slides. And you can share in the chat or jump off mute, but as you look at these and think about the planning, what are some of the important non-negotiables or things that you feel like will help to make that strong foundation for next year? Yeah, Tammy is saying access for all.
Yeah, Nancy says there's always more to consider the deeper you go. And I agree. Even when I just at first read, so our colleague Dean made those questions, I was just like, oh my gosh, this just added questions to me. Like, I just have more questions now.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, the bus one, the one that stuck out to me was how do we social distance on buses? Do we need an adult to monitor that? And I was a high school teacher, so my brain was like, yes, we do. Social distance, not a thing.
Yeah. Yes, and Cindy mentioned the social emotional support preparedness. We know that will be a big thing coming in as well, as that setting those structures up at the beginning of the year. And we have a video later that we're going to show, but we know how important teaching those social emotional skills are explicitly. And so how can we be prepared?
So, and a couple of folks in the chat were talking about rural areas and preparedness. And one of the questions in the document is specific to internet access for staff, which is a unique challenge, I think, in some of our more rural areas in North Carolina. And it's not necessarily because of rural, sometimes it's just mountains or there's no providers in the area. And so thinking through access for faculty also while we're thinking through this. And parents, that's a great consideration. If we do A day, B day, which would make us not need twice as many buses, but how do we have enough teachers and instructional time in that structure for A day, B day?
Yeah, and when you think about the A day, B day, do you have staff there both days?
Mm-hmm.
Some staff work A day and some staff work B day. And what about the 6-year-old?
Yeah.
You know, if this is an elementary, I work in high school, but what if it's elementary and the student's only coming on A days? Well, what about the B days? The parents may have to work. What we have to think about the caregiving aspect of it, and what will parents do?
Well, and what will teachers who are parents do?
Right, exactly.
Because A day, B day, what if they
doesn't exactly work for parents who have small children at home.
Yes, especially if they have kids on different middle school or or one's in elementary, one's in middle, because they're not, going to the same building.
A day and one kid on a B day.
Right. Yeah.
It can't work.
And so Cindy says definitely non-negotiable is flexibility, patience, and compassion. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. And I think for all of these things as leaders, you know, along with flexibility, patience, and compassion is this, and maybe it goes right along with the compassion, but it's in addition to that is the just being open to listening to what the community is saying. And, you know, we can't please every person in the community. We're not, and you all know that very well as school leaders, but being able to listen to their concerns. And sometimes they bring up ideas and things that you hadn't even thought about. And so just how are you going to listen? And how are you going to let them be open to sharing with you? Yeah, Karen's saying inclusion PD for all, right? Like, how are we going to make sure that we have the professional learning for our teachers and, you know, for both our regular ed as well as our IEP students, and making sure that everybody feels not only comfortable, but also that we're meeting the needs for all of those students. And what will it look like? You know, I think some of the things that we've been talking about for a long time in education, differentiation is one, but also inclusion classrooms and, you know, push in with special ed teachers. Some of those things might have to, just by nature of remote learning, they have to happen. And so how can we make sure that those special ed teachers are having time to plan with the regular ed teachers, if that is the case, that they are supporting the teachers, right? And then, yeah, families that don't speak English, right? That is a huge one. Teresa and I, and Teresa, I think I'm locked into full screen. I can't share links when I'm presenting slides, but maybe you could go ahead right now and share the Juntos
I
flyer.
will do that. It's
that
towards
is,
the end.
Yeah. The communication with families is a huge barrier, but also maybe something we just need to think about ways. And we worked with the Juntos, which is a program that works with middle and high school families and students in certain districts, and your district may or may not have the Juntos program, but it's out of NC State. And so we partnered with the leadership team of Juntos to kind of think about what are ways that school leaders like you all can connect with your Latino families. And so there's a document that maybe will give you a few ideas there.
Yeah. And in addition, we've heard additional concerns for accessibility for deaf and blind students, which is it's a unique niche that becomes further and further difficult to reach, especially as if we can use closed captioning, what if that child doesn't have internet access? There's so many rabbit holes for us to go into trying to have the plan A, plan B, seamless instruction. And thinking about a lot of what Nancy and I have been talking about is that the first couple of weeks, how it will look different. And a lot of our developing these strong roots for success is going to require less content instruction in those first couple of weeks than we would typically see, and a lot of focus on building other skills. And there's the ever-present question of when do faculty, if August 17th is a student day, when do faculty return? Which I think we're all still waiting on guidance. Unless anybody has more guidance on that. I have not heard any yet. So that was the consideration for some strong roots for our staff and things that we think are just non-negotiable. How are we going to build supports for success in those areas? And thinking about students. And so for students, I feel like we have perhaps not research-based for the specific area or for COVID-19 in a pandemic, but we do have some good research that we can draw on to help us think about what are students going to need in this environment. And so one of our go-to resources is the Turnaround organization, Turnaround for Children. And they have this concept of relationships, routines, and resilience. And a lot of their work began after 9/11 and thinking about how do you serve trauma, how do you serve students that have experienced trauma, and they're now expanding and extending beyond obviously the 9/11 construct. And they have some resources set up for us that help us understand relationships, routines, and resilience from this lens. But also thinking, this one is a newer one specific to COVID-19. And Nancy, this link is under the slide too, if you want to drop that in there. Thinking about the top of this is what can be done at home to help foster relationship routines and resilience. And then the bottom is upon reentry, which I think is a great new resource for us to have to think about. Oh, it won't let you. That's all right. I'll drop it in there after. To think about like what do they need when they come back? And Nancy and I had a specific conversation about students' needs around, like, when we think of our younger students, and they don't have to be a younger student, but thinking about smaller children who have been told you can't go to school yet because people are getting sick. Well, now what happens to these kids when we start to say, time to go back to school? And did we inadvertently, through our, being truthful, having honest discussions, did we create fear of going back to school? And so thinking about relationships and how we can start to have those conversations and making kids feel safe and trusting in a school environment. Taking a lot of time at the beginning of the school year next year to think and intentionally build strong relationships with these kids, and learning more about their family situation than we maybe would have in the first couple of weeks of school, because it's going to be essential that we build that trust and we understand what they're going to need in their home. Routines are something we always have focused on at the beginning of the year, but now we have to think about, okay, well, this is going to be a little more different and a little more intense, because now we have to build supports for routines for even simple things like asking questions of your teacher when you're not in the classroom, which is something my daughter's middle school is having a lot of trouble with. They had office hours set up and they had to get feedback because the kids weren't showing up for office hours. And it turns out these kids are, middle school. My daughter's 14, but the feedback came that they were just uncomfortable dropping in at any time within an hour. They were like, you kind of missed the beginning. I don't know how to get out of the call after I ask. I don't really just want to drop in on a teacher. And they had to go to appointment slots. So routines look a little different when you end up remote, and the way that kids think about them, we sometimes as adults don't realize. These are different routines we need to establish at the beginning of the year. So this is how we ask questions in the classroom. And if I'm not physically here with you, this is the routine we're going to have for when I'm not with you. And that spans grade levels that maybe I, as a parent, didn't anticipate. I didn't know that my daughter didn't know how to get off of that call with her teacher, and she was staying the whole hour every time. So I didn't know that. And then resilience, which is something we've talked about a whole lot.
And Teresa, before you jump to resilience, can I just say something about routines for younger students? So I had the opportunity I was with my sister and watching her with her first grader, and we were outside and she was just having a time with him, went over to do a little social distancing, but trying to help him finish his work. And I watched her, and she's not an educator, but I don't know if any of you all have seen this or heard this from parents who aren't educators. But so in her trying to help him, it's probably similar to how she helps him with homework, in that, you know, he's working on the homework. She's trying to work on her work over, you know, sitting beside him at the table, but then she checks it, you know, kind of looks it over or checks it. What ultimately ended up happening was that she was kind of, you know, there wasn't a period on one of the sentences. He didn't actually have one of the answers correct. And so she was making him go back and correct it. He was, and you know, none of it was bad, but it was all things she thought as a parent, she was doing what was right. And by helping her child, but really what she was doing, you know, my poor nephew was so frustrated by the end. I could see it after like this 15 minutes because he was having to correct everything, and everything was, you know, everything wasn't perfect. And so I think the routines are not only important for our students, but also for parents. If we go back to this, what other supports can we put in place to help both older parents set expectations and support their students, but also how can we help our younger parents who have younger students at home actually not feel like they need to sit and do the work side by side with the student? Because I know as a former kindergarten and first grade teacher, I don't sit and correct every little piece of information that a student is working on. So how can we help parents feel comfortable with that too? That's important for routines.
Yeah, absolutely. And thinking about open house might need to look very different next year. There might be some parent education nights where we can help them understand that in kindergarten, we don't correct how every single word is spelled because we're working on this piece of literacy right now. And so I might not tell them I might not be focused when I'm giving feedback on how they spelled every word. So parent education is going to be important too. And then the ever important idea of resilience. And how can we build resilience while still being sensitive to people's immediate trauma and need? And all these changes that are happening to our kids and our teachers at the same time, and us as leaders. So we're going to just take a couple of things to take into consideration, and we're going to draw back on some of the things we've talked about previously in Connects. So Nance, if you can pop to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about the brain and what we know about the brain. And so we've talked to you all previously about the idea of trauma-induced or stress and how it, you know, washes the brain with cortisol, and it makes our reactions very different, and the amygdala takes over. We get very emotional. But the piece that we need to get to mentally is that the idea of taking time to build relationships is so important, because while cortisol actually is that hormone that causes us to not think logically and to feel stress, oxytocin is the kind of the combatant. It's arch nemesis. Oxytocin is the feel-good hormone that helps you to feel recovered and safe and get back some of that prefrontal cortex and logical thinking brain that's ready to learn. And the reason I'm talking about this now is because a lot of times people will get very uncomfortable, adults and parents will get really uncomfortable with saying we're taking instructional time to explicitly build relationships, build community. But what research shows us is that oxytocin is released when you are with a trusted, stable adult. And so having that relationship is so, so very important. When kids are feeling like a lot of stress and a lot of change, they need to know that where they're going is safe and they can trust the adults there. And then they can start to have that oxytocin release and get back into that learning brain environment. And so we want them to feel safe, but we also want them to learn. And so remembering that all the time we spend on building those relationships is worth it, because it is the access to learning that the kids need. So it's so very important. And then another step to that is breaking things down into manageable chunks. And this is true for all kids. 18-year-old kids that are showing up as seniors need these things broken down into manageable chunks. And so we love this quote that says, when we do break overwhelming things into manageable chunks, and this can be about instruction or COVID-19, the whole situation, it can transform fear from forget everything and run, that's the amygdala response and to face everything and rise. And so thinking about taking meaningful time at the beginning of next year to give kids time and space to actually think through what's happening and what changes they're comfortable with, they're uncomfortable with, to have those conversations, but also thinking about everything has to come at them in manageable chunks now. So their schedule changes, which I'm sure we will inevitably encounter at some point, their content into manageable chunks, thinking about how does that shift how we do it. And also thinking about, in order for kids to get to this resilience and the face everything and rise, we can't just like say, okay, we're moving on now. We have to help them build the skills. And so that's where taking time as a whole school-wide to build this social and emotional learning skills that they need to be successful, not only to learn, but to be successful in an environment where they need to be a new kind of socially aware, right? They need to understand how to build relationships when they're being taken in and out of a place, and they're remote and they're together. And so if we think about the individual competencies that fall under, this is the castle wheel, and I apologize, I reference it so often I forget to pause and tell people. This is, Castle's one of the leading research organizations talking about social and emotional learning, and these are the constructs that they break it into. And the nice thing about the castle wheel and why we refer to it a lot is not only is it strongly tied to research, it breaks down into competencies. And the competencies that are underneath each of these five they're just on the next slide, Nance, are really where I feel like it gets tangible and teachable. And so how can we, in a school-wide way, build language and understanding around all of these sub-competencies in social and emotional learning? And so how do we build appreciation for diversity, empathy for others? How do we work on perspective taking? How do we ingrain some of this common language across our schools? And there are programs for this that you can actually purchase. But what the research shows is that unless you spend time on this year after year after year consistently and build these skills with students across years, it's not a one-year implementation. It's not an after school, we talk about this. It's not just an advisory, it's across the whole school across years. And so here is just a quick video that we're gonna show to talk about like explicitly teaching social and emotional learning. We think we are.
They're more practicing self-regulation. I noticed that they try a little harder. They really try to do self-talk and deep breaths and those exercises like that. And they tell me about it too. And that it's helped them not only at school but at home too. And their parents have come and thanked me and told me about the big change that they have seen in them.
It's helping us to like control ourselves more, be more aware of ourselves, show more empathy, show more compassion. It's just like helping us to like learn all these skills and like build up these skills inside of ourselves and everybody else.
I feel like happy because I get to express my feelings. It's like if you using the upstairs brain, that means that you're thinking more. And like if you use your downstairs brain, that means that your actions, reflexes real quick. But if you use your upstairs brain, your actions won't come real quick. You'll think about what to do before the problem happens.
And the reference to upstairs brain and downstairs brain is just the language that they're using to talk about that prefrontal cortex versus the amygdala response, which is great and very age appropriate language for the kids in that particular school. But you can see that they've worked on it explicitly with the language they want to use, and they're using it across the school. The kids know it, they practice it. And so they do that. They do explicit instruction, especially to establish that common language and understanding, but they also build it in implicitly in other ways through dialogue and ways to have collaboration and group talk, that like acceptable dialogue between student to student, acceptable dialogue, parent, teacher to student. And so thinking about in our school next year, how are we going to build these skills across? And we do have on the next slide some good just some ideas for what it can look like in action. And of course, you can't do all of these. at once, but just to give you some quick ideas of ways to do things like little 10-minute blips, or there are actually big, long, week-long activities that you can integrate into your school day to help the kids kind of build these social and emotional skills. And also the adults. We like to say, don't forget that the adults also need practice and reinforcement, and that includes me. So that everybody needs kind of a way to be supported in always growing these skills. And then this is, you know, thinking about the things we have to learn to really help kids successfully learn remotely. They're very similar to the things, obviously their environment is different. And so thinking about flexible learning environments is something we've been talking about in personalization for years. But this is a whole new level of flexible. And so how can we have a lot of flexibility? What information, these learner profiles, they've all of a sudden been expanded. We need to know not just things about how the student learns, but also things about their home environment and what else is pulling at them. Are our high school kids going to work part of the day? I know a lot of high school kids that are going to work part of the day. Are the middle school kids babysitting part of the day? Because that information in their profile is going to help us design instruction where they have a chance of being successful, even if they are remote for part of the year next year. Or some days next year. And thinking about how do we get to these personalization and this competency-based progression, a lot of it is going to fall at the beginning of the year through assessment and building learner agency skills. And so while we are not proponents of assessing children to death, we have to think of very creative ways to integrate formative assessment so that not only do we get those early school day assessment pieces, but we have ways to continue assessing and building agency in kids so they can help to inform their own learning. And this agency, Nancy can tell us great stories about how kids at a very young age can really take control and start to guide their own learning. And one of the ways we think about this formative assessment and constantly going through is the idea of single point rubrics. And so I don't know if you all have a lot of experience with these, but it's just a shift from our typical rubric where we're telling them these are all, this is the matrix, this is what I require, and it really simplifies it down. And you know, as we've talked about remote learning, we're saying simple, less is more, less is more. Well, this is one of the ways to get to less is more. It is to create the center of that rubric. Oh, I'm trying to click, it's not working because obviously that's not my screen. A single point rubric has this center column, and Nance, can you click on that and kind of scroll down? I'm sorry, I wasn't very well prepared. I should have put it on the slide for you. If you'll scroll down to where she has an example of a single point. It's just a little farther down. The center column of a single point rubric is the criteria that you're looking for. And so basically you're saying, this is what I see as success. This is a proficient learner. But the benefit is the student sees kind of, here's the standard, this is what we're working towards. But then they also, it leaves space for feedback. And this is the kind of feedback we're looking for student growth. It says, these are the areas that I have concerns about, and you can make notes as a teacher in those areas. And these are the areas you're advanced in. And the difference comes in, it's a very simplified version, but you can give a great deal of detail. And so the students aren't just getting what was missing from the work, they're getting like, this is where I saw you do some great things. And these are areas that I think you need to work on. And with that information, a student can take it and figure out what they need to change to grow, but also where they're excelling, which is an important piece of information. I think some of our standard rubrics, the rubrics tell them what they did, what you'd expected and what they did, but it doesn't say, wow, you really went above and beyond on this piece. And I'm really proud of how your sentence structure got more complex, or whatever you're seeing in it as an advanced skill.
And Teresa, this is just similar to the single point rubric we just gave them.
Yes, and we did just give you a single point rubric, which I forgot, Nancy, that was the other document was a single point rubric. And the other benefit is parents do tend to be able to understand them because they see it and they're like, okay, well, this is where you need to change, and this is what you did good at. So it's a great way to give positive and growth feedback. And when we start to use formative assessment tools like single point rubrics, we can start to give kids the possibility of having more agency over their learning, because then they can start to say what they can do, and they can see, like, I can learn this, I just need to work on this piece. And they can set their own goals, and they can collaboratively set their goals with their teacher based on, these are the areas I saw in my rubric that I need to improve. And I don't need to worry about these areas because I already am advanced in those areas. So I just need to continue doing that. And you're starting to really build that metacognition, and you're giving them language where they can talk to each other. Like, I'm still missing some of my grammar and punctuation, but I'm really good at pulling out the theme that's happening across this series. Starting to like provide that language for the kids. And so as you think about, as a leader, you start to think about, what is a non-negotiable? What do you have to have in place for students to be successful next year? What are you working on? If you want to drop it in the chat or jump on the mic and share with us kind of what you're working on putting into place to help students be successful with the changes that might happen at the beginning of next year.
You know, while you all are thinking or writing, I just wanted to bring up something that Curtis mentioned about, you know, and he's talking about his high school students, the lack of expectation from the parents, which also help like maybe create this lack of motivation for students. And so I'm just kind of curious, does anybody put things into place or have ideas on how to support motivation and expectations for students, especially when maybe the families aren't as involved or supportive?
I can tell you that I, as a high school parent, made some assumptions about my son's ability to be motivated. And I got a phone call just from one of his teachers, not from all four. And it really did kind of, I needed that phone call, and I am an educator, and I needed that phone call to help me reconsider what supports he needed to be successful. Because I thought I had him set up like perfectly, but turns out I really didn't. And he did need more support from me than when he had his teachers face to face. And that one phone call made a big difference for me.
Yeah. It's great.
So I'm seeing Cindy's talking about extending her morning meeting.
Yeah.
Which
kind of goes into that relationship building, right?
Yeah.
Like, how can we build those relationships? Having those relationships do often help.
Yes. And then there is a question about like what's going to happen with school accountability if this continues into next year, which is, I think, a huge piece that we're all still wondering about.
I think, Tracy, I agree with you, training the students on specific technology from, you know, not only from a digital citizen standpoint, but also just making sure that they understand how to communicate and how to making sure that they're comfortable with the technology, so that if they do have access at home, when they go home, they feel comfortable. You know, I was even talking, Teresa and I were talking with a friend of ours who is out of state, but talking about maybe even, do you need to have practice remote learning days at school during the year, where at the beginning of the year, where maybe everybody kind of goes to different corners of the room, or teacher gives all the assignments the way that they would during a remote learning, especially if you're going to use technology, and kind of give students an opportunity to kind of experience what it's going to be like with that teacher. I don't know, you know, but maybe that is something that you want to think about.
Oh, and then there's a question about, is Deanna on to share information? Deanna, can you share some information about the parent speaker? There's a question in the chat. Are you able to jump on your mic or drop it in the chat?
I just texted her to see if she was still really there or not. I didn't mean to call her out.
Oh, no, that's okay. Absolutely. That's fine. I was trying to catch all the questions in the chat.
Yeah. We had a really good one that actually did a Zoom parenting session with her school through Zoom. And so she said that she had about 60 or 70 parents come and they found it really helpful. So, you know, even maybe building something along there that, you know, when we talk about building routines, you know, or setting expectations at home, just again, having someone who doesn't look like mom or dad say, hey, try this, or even, you know, the school telling, but just somebody from outside might be helpful for schools.
Yes, that's so helpful. I know for my sister in that situation, I kind of talked to her afterwards a little bit, and sometimes it all, you know, sometimes from a sister it's good, sometimes it can be a little bit contentious, but it actually was a good thing. It really helped her to see. I was like, you know, this isn't like doing homework with him every day. You know, when you do homework, that's a different situation. This is his classwork. It's okay for him to not have everything, you know, perfect or just right. You want the teacher to see what he's struggling with. You don't want everything to be corrected before he turns it in. Which is kind of the way she was approaching it, which was very frustrating for her as well as, so having that speaker, I think that's a great idea to get that parent speaker in.
Yeah. Something that has also helped me. So thinking of like the parent speaker idea and having a Zoom call is as my children have gone to feedback and not grades, I have also my high school son who was not doing his work. I wasn't, my typical way of checking that was PowerSchool, and PowerSchool is not being updated, but Google Classroom is being updated. And I didn't realize that I could go see the feedback as a parent in his Google Classroom. And it was not for lack of information from the teachers, because I was given every Google Classroom code at open house. But at that point, I didn't sign up for all of them because I didn't need it. But now that they're remote, they're using Google Classroom a lot, and now I need it. And I didn't pull that out of the recesses of my brain for myself. I needed someone to tell me, you have to go get that. You have to go do this now. So.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for sharing these ideas. Hopefully we've given you some things to think about. And I know it's always great to have, you know, have you all share in the chat. Just remember that timing, schedule, groups, location, there's a lot of things that we have to be flexible on. And so what can we focus now on? Building those strong structures that blend and allow us to capitalize on community and empathy in order to set our students and our families and our teachers up for success. I think, like we always say, you know, don't do it by yourself, build a team. And hopefully you have those documents that could be helpful. If you have other things that you're willing to share with us that we can share with other leaders, we're always looking for that. I think that something, you know, kind of interestingly, maybe as we wrap up today, and maybe if you just want to put it in the chat, but we're kind of curious, or you can complete the survey, but do we want to continue this in June? Do you want to have an FI Connects in June? And if so, what topics would you like to talk about? Or you can either put it in the chat or complete the survey. But Teresa and I will hang around and, you know, okay, so Kathy's saying maybe in June. Oh, a parenting made easier session for us. It was awesome and so relevant. Okay, good. Thank you, Deanna. Deanna, if you have any resources that you would be willing to share from that, or even a video that we could, or a way to contact Nancy, that would be great. So Kathy says she would love to have FI Connects in June. Maybe we'll have one, you know, kind of thinking about it, if it's a good idea to have it before school ends or once it ends. I know you all will be very busy, but all right, June sounds good. So it sounds like maybe we'll do one in June. And I will put up our information. Teresa, are you able to put the link to the good,
yep,
Alex is saying more sessions? Yep. So Teresa will put the FI Connects in there. As well as our links. I'll put our email up here if you want to email us. And Deanna, if you could just email the information to Teresa or myself, that would be great. Thank you. And there is the turnaround resources. That is a great resource fabulous for both leaders, teachers, parents. There's a lot of good information there.
A lot of stuff. Yeah.
So we hope everybody has a great Tuesday afternoon and good luck. But I guess we'll see you in June. So I guess we won't see you
Yes,
before
hopefully
school.
we'll see you soon. Let us know in that survey what topic would be helpful. And if you realize later a different topic would be helpful, you should have the bit.lys for all of these and our email information. You can email us. You don't have to have the topic at the tip of your tongue right now. Oh, Nance, can you scroll back to the slide link for Janice?
Yes.
There it is. Yep. And let me see if I can just put it in the chat real quick too for people. Okay. Oops.